You want to convince strangers to pay to sleep in your house? That's the worst idea I've ever heard. The year was 2007. In a small apartment in San Francisco, a recent college graduate was reading an investor's email. Although this was his 47th rejection letter he received, Brian Chesky remained optimistic and immediately prepared the next email to the next investor to find a way to finance his startup company. His company was called Airbnb and Breakfast. Like its name entails, the company provides Airbnb and breakfast for its users. More specifically, it connects people who are looking for accommodation and people who are willing to rent out their homes for a night to earn extra income. What inspired this business idea was, Brian realized that whenever a large exhibition takes place in a city, hotel prices would soar. These high-traffic events drive up the demand for hotel rooms, and because supply can't be increased in accordance, the price naturally increases. Brian saw an opportunity in the supply gap. To work off this, he needed to raise funds. He pitched this idea to over 40 Silicon Valley investors, hoping to get them to see the same potential he does. However, all of them passed on this idea. So being the fresh out of college student with an idea and no funding, Brian had to overdraw several of his credit cards to keep the company afloat. Fast forward 15 years later, this so-called worst idea became the world's largest accommodation company in the world. Its $100 billion market value exceeds hotel groups Marriott, Hilton, and Hyatt combined. And behind its success are two college students with no expertise or funding. Welcome back to Money Therapy. Today, we'll take a look at what it took the young entrepreneurs to build the world's largest travel accommodation company in 15 years. If you look at it now, the investors who turned away Airbnb at first probably regrets the decision. It's not that they weren't smart people, but back in 2008, it wasn't a tough pitch to turn down. Typically, an angel investor will evaluate the project from two angles: the idea and the team behind it. Regardless of whether the business idea was promising, its team composition was questionable. At the time, a lot of startup projects had founding teams with business or computer science background. However, Brian and his roommate turned business partner, Joe Gebbia, were graduates from the Rhode Island School of Design. Brian majored in industrial design, while Joe majored in graphic design. After completing their majors, the two had no idea what they were going to do. At first, Brian worked as an industrial designer and Joe headed west to Silicon Valley. Back in 2007, when Facebook was on the rise, the story of how Mark Zuckerberg founded the multi-billion-dollar tech giant in college began to circulate. It inspired a lot of college students to start their own businesses, and Joe was one of them. He moved to the technology hub to experience the entrepreneurial spirit and technological innovation. At the same time, he urged his roommate Brian to join him as well. Not too long after, Brian made the move with only $1,000 in his pocket. Several months later, the two were still stuck trying to figure out what to do. Their savings were almost gone and rent was nearly due. That's when Joe came up with an idea to take some financial pressure off. The IDSA Designers Conference was being held in San Francisco. San Francisco didn't have a huge selection of hotels in the first place, and the sudden surge of visitors in the area made it difficult to find accommodation within the conference dates. So on September 22, 2007, Joe wrote in an email to Brian, "Brian, I thought of a way to make a few bucks, turning our place into designer bed and breakfast, offering young designers who come into town a place to crash during the 4-day event, complete with wireless internet, a small desk space, sleeping mat, and breakfast each morning." Ha! At the time of this email, Joe had no intention of changing the world, nor did he know whether this business model was even feasible. All he did was observe, find a demand, identify the problem, and try to provide a solution. Because the two didn't have the resources to provide a real bed for these travelers, they resorted to a sleeping mat or air mattress. The air mattress was just enough for people to sleep on, comfortable enough and cost efficient. This type of product is commonly used in startups and known as the minimum viable product, or MVP for short. With this in mind, Brian and Joe immediately bought 3 air mattresses and registered Air Bed and Breakfast as their business domain name. To their surprise, all 3 spots were sold. One of them was sold to a woman from Boston, another one to a man from India, and the last to a man from Utah. And just like that, Airbnb had its first users. The reason why these 3 travelers chose Airbnb was simple, because it was cheap. Each mattress bought cost $80 a night, which was at least $100 cheaper than the average night at a hotel. But after their first sale, Brian and Joe didn't have much time to celebrate when they were hit with the next issue. No one used their service after the conference was over. So in order to recruit new users, they began to promote their service at large-scale conferences. For instance, Brian ran to attend the South by Southwest Music Festival to search for potential users. And that night, Airbnb had 2 lodgers, one being Brian himself. Instead of feeling discouraged by these results, Brian turned his focus to preparing for the next event. This went on until Airbnb got its first breakout. The DNC in Denver had 80,000 attendees. The problem is there was only a total of 27,000 hotel reservations available. You don't have to do the math to know the demand for logging exceeds the supply by a lot. Among those who didn't book hotel rooms, 80 of them turned to Airbnb. Users don't seem like much now that Airbnb is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, but back then, to the 2 struggling entrepreneurs, this was more than enough. However, after the wave was over, they were left with the same problem. As soon as each conference ends, orders would plummet off a cliff. The company's performance was only bringing in a few $100s a month. In order to support the company and themselves, Brian had debts of over $100,000 and several overdrawn credit cards. So since the airbeds weren't working out, Brian and Joe decided to turn the focus to something else to relieve some of the financial pressure. They thought, well, everyone needs to eat, and just so happens that our name is Airbed and Breakfast. So they decided that they work on the breakfast part too. During the DNC conference, Joe and Brian sold presidential theme box cereal at $40 a pop. They connected with an old college friend who happened to own and operate a printing shop. He was happy to help print the cereal boxes royalty-free for old time's sake. Once they got the packaging down, Brian and Joe went to various supermarkets and found cereal for $1 a box. From there, it was day and night of folding, gluing, and packaging the cereal box into their printed boxes. The 1,000 boxes of repackaged cereal brought in another $30,000 of income. And whatever wasn't sold became their breakfast. Although selling cereal was enough to sustain them for a little while, not too long after, they began to question their entrepreneurial direction. The 2 CEOs spend their day folding boxes and gluing boxes. Brian even joked about how he can't seem to imagine Mark Zuckerberg doing the same thing when he started Facebook. Brian began to look and think back on details regarding their process up to this point. Details like, why did they stick with using an air mattress? Why not real beds? Why did they only target users who came from a conference instead of regular travelers? From here, Joe and Brian made arguably the most important business model transition. They stopped saturating their focus on conference crowds, but transitioned to targeting regular travelers. And finally, they switched out their air mattress to a real bed. New additions naturally come with new challenges. First of all, because beds required landlords, they not only need to find tourists, but also landlords willing to rent out extra beds. Secondly, going back to the problem with their team composition. The really great teams had brilliant engineers and business consultants. The 2 designers realized their professional knowledge and background can only take them so far. For example, one user became skeptical when it was time to pay because there were no official payment system in place. Brian needed the user to write a handwritten check in order to pay for the service. Because of this questionable payment process, the company had a hard time gaining users' trust. People thought it was a scam and left. This ended up in losing them a lot of potential business. For this reason, the 2 designers thought it was time to get an engineer to join the team. And through a friend, they met Nathan. Nathan was a 24-year-old computer scientist graduated from Harvard. Brian and Joe invited them to join Airbnb as a third partner and CTO. The 24-year-old programming genius used Ruby on Rails to develop a whole new website. He placed in a PayPal payment system for their travelers and online payment system to pay their hosts. After the system was put in place, they noticed a gradual increase in users. Now that all pieces of their business models are in place, all they needed was the cherry on top, an investment that is. Airbnb is a platform-based business. This means that the business had the chicken and egg problem. If there were more hosts, there would be more users. But without users, who is going to be the host? One night in November 2008, a full year since Brian and Joe launched Airbnb, they were having dinner with a friend. The topic of how their funding was once again almost gone came up. Their friend then suggested applying for the Y Combinator Startup Fund. Y Combinator is a seed funding organization that helps tech startups through their first phases. This means that the amount of investment they give out is relatively small. Each project can receive up to $85,000 in exchange for 15% of the company's shares. Y Combinators do a couple of things in order to lower their risk threshold. They would take in a large number of projects, and the partners will give founders consultation and advice along the way. At first, Brian and Joe were hesitant to apply for the fund. Based on past experience, Airbnb burns through cash faster than it can make it back. But they thought that there's no harm in trying. So a few weeks later, they were in an interview with the founder of the organization, Paul Graham. Paul is a very well-known entrepreneur and author within Silicon Valley. His book, Hackers and Painters, discusses the similarities between hackers and painters and the technological issue that occur within the field. It's quite influential among programmers. If you're interested in learning more about Paul and his work, we'll make a video on his story in the future. But for now, let's go back to Paul's interview with Brian and Joe. To say that the interview didn't go very well was an understatement. Paul couldn't understand why anyone would be convinced to let strangers sleep in their bed on their property. And to make it worse, Brian and Joe were completely incapable of answering Paul's question, and the interview ended in less than 10 minutes. But just as they were ready to leave, Joe took out 2 boxes of cereal from his backpack and handed it to Paul. Paul hesitated for a second, staring at the boxes thinking that they were trying to give him something weird. He listened to the story of how the business was sustained by these boxes. Paul changed his mind. He said, "Well, if you can convince people to pay $40 for a box of $4 cereal, you can probably convince people to sleep in other people's beds." Paul's investment philosophy focused on entrepreneurial spirit. A dedicated entrepreneur will find a solution even if there are 100 problems. So Y Combinator ended up investing $20,000 for a 6% stake of Airbnb. 15 years later, that 6% has multiplied over 10,000 times, with a return of over $100 million. Even though YC didn't give Airbnb a large investment, it gave the company the backing of a well-known investor. This gave Airbnb enough attention to be noticed in the Silicon Valley. More and more people began to use Airbnb services, and the platform exceeded 25,000 hosts with over 10,000 users. But the obstacle didn't stop there. The growing number of users also meant a growing number of feedback, good and bad. Everyone had different thoughts and opinions toward the business. Some thought it could operate more like a hotel, and others thought it would be better if it operated more like an agency. Being an unexperienced entrepreneur, Brian wasn't sure what or who to listen to. Paul stepped in and gave the troubled entrepreneurs an important piece of advice. It's better to have 100 people that love you than 1,000,000 people that just sorta like you. Find 100 people that love you. This advice brought Airbnb on a path to a clearer business model. So it's better to make the users who love you happy than to try to please everyone. It was found that among their users, the ones that loved Airbnb the most were the tourists who rented from hosts. A couple of the earliest users are still good friends with Brian to this day, and one of them even invited him to their wedding. After 3 months, Airbed and Breakfast graduated from YC and received a $600,000 investment from Sequoia Capital and officially changed its name to Airbnb. As far as venture capitalists go, Sequoia Capital is one of the most well-known in its industry. They were the first ones to give Steve Jobs a check when he founded Apple, which means Brian and Joe's implausible idea finally received approval from conventional venture capitalists, and they entered the state of entrepreneurship they had originally imagined. In a way, the company went from an email between 2 roommates to a travel and logging giant with a value of $100 billion. But if you look back at that email, you'll see that there were no dream of changing the world, no complex business model and intricate planning. It was just 2 guys with a simple idea to make some extra income. They didn't have an impressive resume and little to no experience in this field. At some point, they were selling cereal to get by. But it just so happens that the last 2 boxes of cereal landed them their first investment from YC. So in other words, there's no such thing as failure when it comes to entrepreneurship. As long as you don't give up, there's always going to be more solution than problems. Of course, we only covered the first year of how the business started. The problems Airbnb faced didn't get any easier after receiving their first investment, but its founders solved each problem in what seems to be the most implausible way. As for what these challenges were and how they solved them, we'll discuss them in a future video. See you in the next one!